In the 1700s, Shepton Mallet sat tucked in the shadow of the Mendip Hills, a small Somerset town where the air smelled of wet wool and the mills by the river sang from sunrise to dusk. Life here was ordinary, and yet not untouched by the extraordinary. Beneath the sound of clattering looms and tolling church bells lingered something older and laced with fear of the unknown. Whispers of witchcraft, charms buried in doorways, and spirits that rode the wind. The townspeople still spoke of the devil in those days, though not by name. They called him Old Nickel Ben, the prince of the power of the air. And when tempests came suddenly out of clear skies, rattling shutters and sweeping through the narrow streets, some swore it was him moving through the valley, collecting what was owed. In the summer of 1768, a storm just like this struck Shepton Mallet. The sky blackened, the wind rose, and the marketplace emptied beneath the ancient stone cross that had watched over the town for centuries. When it passed, the streets were washed clean, and someone was gone forever. Owen Parfitt, an old and invalid man who couldn't even get out of bed himself, had seemingly vanished into thin air within the space of minutes. What happened that day would leave a mark on Shepton Mallet that time never erased, a mystery still whispered about more than 200 years later, a tale of folklore, faith, and fear in which the line between superstition and truth vanished, just as Owen Parfitt did. Hello everybody, happy Harloween and welcome back to my channel. So this Harloween, we've spent a lot of time in the United States, wandering through the haunted hollows of Appalachia, following whispers of secret experiments and government programs that blurred the line between science and the supernatural. But everyone loves a good historical mystery, and for this one, we're leaving behind the backroads of America and traveling somewhere much older, across the ocean to 18th century Somerset, England, a place where faith and folklore still walked hand in hand, and where one summer afternoon a man would vanish so completely that people swore the devil himself had come to claim him. You all know I love to paint a picture for you, to build a world around you until you can almost smell the rain in the air and hear the cobblestones beneath your feet. So get cozy, lock your doors, close your curtains, and let me transport you to a small town called Shepton Mallet, where the air hummed with superstition and a sudden summer storm left behind a mystery that's never been solved. Also, we have Rosie with us today, because Rosie's on some medication and I wanted to watch her, and she's having a surgery in a few days. So I thought it would be nice to have her here with me so I could keep an eye on her, and you guys can help keep an eye on her too during this video. She's very happy to be here, even though you can't tell. So let's dive into the video. But first, we're going to have a word from the sponsor of today's video, Uncommon Goods. If you're anything like me, this is the time of year when you start thinking, what do I get for the people in my life that I actually care about? Because I don't know about you, but I'm over the generic last-minute gifts that end up forgotten in a drawer, or giving somebody you actually know and love a gift card, which is a sign to them that you don't actually know what they want, or you didn't want to take the time to figure it out. So I want to give people something that feels special, something that says, I saw this and thought of you. And that's what I love about Uncommon Goods. They've built an online marketplace full of unique and meaningful gifts made by independent artists and small businesses. Everything feels personal and intentional, and most of it is handmade or customizable, so you're really giving something no one else will. Now, I've already started browsing for my own family. I started this in October, and I found so many things that are just so perfect for them. There's this gorgeous handmade book nook insert that looks like a tiny enchanted library, perfect for my fellow true crime and mystery lovers who like a little magic on their shelves. And these are awesome because you get to assemble them yourself, and they're so pretty and detailed, they even light up. And so now when you look at your bookshelf, you can feel happy at the cuteness of it all, but also proud because you put it together. I also found these personalized constellation mugs that show the night sky from a special date, which is so sweet, such a unique touch, something to hold on to forever and pass down. I also find that the men in my life are notoriously difficult to shop for, but not with Uncommon Goods. We all have football lovers in our lives who would love an NFL game day bingo set that can be personalized with their favorite team's name and colors. Uncommon Goods has that. They also have these real viewers, the little things you used to put up to your face and click through the pictures. But these ones are personalized with your own snapshots and memories, and it's so nostalgic for the kids of the 80s especially, so special to whoever will be lucky enough to receive such a gift. So every time I'm scrolling through the site, I'm surprised by how many creative things I've never seen before. It's like shopping a local artisan market, but from your couch. Cozy blanket, cup of tea, candle flickering, the whole vibe. I'm going to be completely honest with you when I say that the only reason I'm ahead of the game with Christmas shopping this year is because I already purchased so many things from Uncommon Goods, and I kept going through and being like, oh, this person would like this person would like this. So I'm already feeling that itch of excitement at the thought of watching my loved ones open these and witnessing their surprise and delight at how special and unique their gifts are. Uncommon Goods even helps you with corporate gifts. I found that out. So if you have multiple employees to shop for, but you still want them to know how special they are and that you've put thought into their gift, this is the place to achieve that vibe, Uncommon Goods. And what makes it even better is that when you shop with Uncommon Goods, you're supporting real artists and small independent makers, not big corporations. Now, most of their products are crafted in small batches, which means if you see something you love, don't wait too long because it might sell out, but they do restock, and I get emails when they restock things I've been looking at. Plus, every purchase gives back. Uncommon Goods donates $1 from every order to a nonprofit partner of your choice, and they've already given more than $3 million to charity, which makes the holiday season feel even more meaningful. So make your holiday season more unforgettable with Uncommon Goods. Discover one-of-a-kind gifts for everyone on your list and get 15% off your next gift by scanning the QR code on screen or clicking the link in the description box now. Once again, click the link in the description box or scan the QR code and you're going to get 15% off your next gift from Uncommon Goods. Thank you so much to Uncommon Goods for sponsoring today's video, and let's dive in. Shepton Mallet is an ancient town in Somerset, England, situated in a shallow valley at the slope of the Mendip Hills with the River Sheppey running through the town. If you were a resident of Shepton Mallet in the summer of 1768, you'd wake to the sound of the River Sheppey murmuring somewhere beyond the mist, and the faint creak of wagon wheels starting down the turnpike road. The morning air would be damp and cool, carrying the scent of wet wool and smoke from the mill chimneys along the valley. You'd step out into the narrow cobbled streets where the walls of cottages leaned close together, their stone darkened by centuries of rain, and already the day would be stirring. Apprentices hurrying to the looms, farmers driving sheep toward the market square, the sound of hooves striking stone echoing beneath the weathered spire of the old market cross. Beneath its arch, traders would be setting out their wares, cloth, stockings, and salted meats, while women bargained over prices and gossiped about who'd fallen ill or quarreled last. The river below would flash silver through the trees, turning the wheels of the cloth mills where damp air hung heavy with dye and steam. And high above it all, on the slope of the hill, the larger houses of the merchants would catch the first sunlight, their tidy gardens and carved lintels a quiet reminder of who prospered here and who labored for them. It was a town alive with industry and rumor, and even in the late 1700s, it is reported that between 3,000 to 4,000 people called this town their home. At this time, the average rural village often held only a few hundred inhabitants, but Shepton Mallet was different. It was a thriving market town, its streets alive with movement and noise, its lifeblood the industry that drove it. The sound of water wheels turning on the River Sheppey never really stopped, It was the heartbeat of the place, the steady rhythm that kept its mills spinning and its people working. This was a town that needed strong bodies to feed the looms, haul the cloth, and keep the wheels turning. And at the center of Shepton Mallet was a marketplace, a cobbled square where people gathered to meet and trade. And the Shepton Mallet Market Cross is a historic stone monument that stands in the center of the Shepton Mallet Marketplace even to this day. And in the 1700s, the market cross would have been nothing short of awe-inspiring to most people who lived in the town. Most homes in Shepton Mallet were 2 stories at the most, and the market cross, rising nearly 50 feet into the sky, would have towered over everything around it. Its octagonal canopy, tall pointed arches, and pinnacled spire created vertical drama in a town where the skyline was otherwise low and irregular. And understand that even in 1768, the cross was already old, older than anyone alive could remember. Dating back to 1500 AD, the cross had stood there for more than 2 centuries by the 1700s, watching as wars came and went, as plagues swept through, as fashions changed, and generations passed beneath its arches. The industry of Shepton Mallet was textiles, but before the mills lined the river valley and the sound of clattering wheels filled the air, the town's livelihood was already woven into cloth. Centuries earlier, refugees from the Low Countries had brought their craft across the Channel, fleeing the fires of religious war. And when we speak of the Low Countries, we're talking about modern-day Belgium, the Netherlands, and northern France, areas that were under Spanish rule in the 16th century. In the early 1500s, these lands were part of the Habsburg Empire, and at the time, these provinces were among the most prosperous regions in Europe, with bustling trade ports, thriving universities, and a very steadily rising middle class. But prosperity also bred curiosity, and with it, dissent. When Martin Luther's ideas began spreading across Europe in the 1520s, the people of the Low Countries were among the quickest to listen. Printers in Antwerp were smuggling out Lutheran pamphlets almost as soon as they were written. Later, Calvinist doctrines from Geneva took hold, especially among merchants, scholars, and artisans. By the 1540s and 1550s, large numbers of ordinary citizens had quietly converted to Protestantism. But in a land under strict Catholic rule, that was a very dangerous act. The Inquisition was unleashed across the Low Countries, bringing with it the interrogation, torture, and execution of anyone found with Protestant books. Between 1523 and 1566, thousands were arrested, public burnings became grim spectacles, and whole families fled cities like Antwerp, Ghent, and Bruges under the cover of night. As towns burned and loyalties fractured, tens of thousands of Protestant refugees fled north to the Netherlands or across the sea to England, Germany, and Scandinavia. England especially became a sanctuary under the Protestant reign of Elizabeth I. The crown saw an opportunity because these refugees weren't just victims of persecution, they were highly skilled craftsmen and traders. Among them were the Flemish and Walloon weavers who would eventually bring their expertise to places like Somerset, Wiltshire, and Kent. They introduced new weaving techniques, finer fabrics, and dyeing methods that revolutionized England's cloth trade. They settled in Somerset valleys where the water ran clear and strong enough to turn the mills, and they taught the English their trade, how to spin a finer wool, how to dye it richer, how to work it until it shone like silk. They brought with them their looms, their dyes, and their quiet defiance, and from their suffering grew an industry that would shape Shepton Mallet for generations. From the center marketplace of Shepton Mallet, narrow streets radiated outward, lined with small stone cottages, workshops, and inns. Closer to the river, where the mills were, you'd find weavers' and cloth workers' cottages, and they were small and often damp homes clustered near the water-powered mills. Higher up the slope of the valley, on drier and more elevated ground, stood the larger houses of the wealthy cloth merchants, built with better stone and featuring small walled-in gardens. And on the edge of town, near Board Cross, sat 6 stout cottages where our mystery takes place, because one of those cottages was home to an old disabled man who was whispered about around town long before he made his sudden exit. 69-year-old Owen Parfitt was in bad health, a drunkard who was known to shift into bad moods and be prone to violence in the days before a stroke had left him unable to walk. And in Shepton Mallet, they said all sorts of things about old Owen, that he was a rogue, a pirate, a man who trafficked in the unsavory, even someone who dabbled in black magic. But he wasn't always an old, grumpy man. Owen Parfitt had once been young, full of life, and ready to take on any adventure. The story goes that when he was just a young boy, Owen had run away from his home in Shepton Mallet, and he had traveled to America. Newspaper articles from the 1800s say, quote, "From remarks which he occasionally let fall in later years, it was surmised that Owen had been mixed up with strange company out in the West, and there were some who attributed certain tastes which the old man had acquired to the same source." End quote. They said that Owen had developed a taste for brawling brandy punch, and he had learned this from the buccaneers and pirates of the Western Seas. Now, allow me to be your old-timey translator and explain what all of that means. Basically, brawling brandy punch was just a way to say Owen had become skilled in the rough, drunken, brawling culture of sailors and adventurers. Basically, he had learned to drink and fight like a pirate, and he had learned all of this from these buccaneers and pirates of the Western Seas. So in the 17th and early 18th centuries, the term Western Seas referred broadly to the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico and the Atlantic waters off the Americas, the great expanse of ocean that connected the European empires to their colonies in the New World. It was a place of extraordinary opportunity and adventure, and also almost no law. Here, Spanish treasure fleets carried gold and silver mined in Peru and Mexico back to Europe. Merchant ships from England, France, and the Netherlands hauled sugar, tobacco, and enslaved Africans between continents. And between them all, like sharks circling the trade routes, sailed the privateers and buccaneers, men who thrived in the gray space between empire and outlaw. Privateers were essentially licensed pirates, seamen who carried letters of marque, which were official documents granting them permission to raid and plunder enemy ships during wartime. During Elizabeth I's reign, England relied on privateers like Sir Francis Drake, John Hawkins, and Walter Raleigh to basically harass the mighty Spanish Empire without ever formally declaring war. They attacked treasure fleets, looted coastal towns, and returned home to royal favor and knighthoods, their ships heavy with stolen silver and sugar. By the 1600s, this practice had become an industry. Privateers operated from Caribbean bases like Port Royal, Jamaica, and Tortuga, hunting under the thin veil of legality. When peace came and their letters of marque expired, many simply kept going, turning pirate rather than return to poverty. The buccaneers emerged a little later, and they were rougher, wilder, and far less official. These were originally runaway sailors, escaped slaves, and exiled soldiers who survived on the fringes of society in the islands of Hispaniola and Tortuga. By the mid-1600s, they had taken to the sea in small bands, forming a kind of floating brotherhood that attacked Spanish shipping and settlements. They were multilingual, multicultural, English, French, Dutch, African, indigenous, all united by little more than greed and vengeance against Spain. So if you've seen Pirates of the Caribbean, you understand what we're talking about here. If you've seen all the movies, you probably have a better understanding because you get it all in Pirates of the Caribbean. You got pirates, you got buccaneers, you got privateers, you've got all of it. So by the time Owen Parfitt was a young man, the golden age of piracy was drawing to a close, but its myths still burned bright. This was the era of Blackbeard, Calico Jack Rackham, Anne Bonny, Mary Read, and Charles Vane, infamous outlaws who roamed the same waters once patrolled by these privateers. The Caribbean became a chessboard of shifting alliances and sudden betrayals. Spain, England, France, and the Netherlands all claimed dominion, but no one truly ruled the sea. Now, if Owen had run away to America as a young boy, the most plausible and historically grounded path for him to have taken would have led to a port city like Charleston, Savannah, or Kingston. Now, at this time, England's colonies in North America and the Caribbean were booming, with sugar, tobacco, rum, and enslaved labor, fueling a global economy. From every major English port, ships sailed westward to the Americas and the Caribbean, and Bristol, in particular, was one of England's busiest trade ports. As a kid with no money and no way to travel, Owen would have needed to board a ship at a port that was geographically close to him, and Bristol, only about 25 miles away from Shepton Mallet, that was a distance Owen could have walked in one day using the Bristol Turnpike Road, which happened to be right outside of his cottage. Bristol at that time would have been a chaotic place full of noise, filth, and movement, with ships constantly coming and going, and the docks teeming with recruiters known as crimps. So these men would search for young boys they could lure or even force onto ships to supply the vessels with cheap disposable labor. And that's why boys were everywhere on these ships: cabin boys, powder monkeys, errand runners. They learned to tie knots and haul sails long before they were men, and they learned the lifestyle of a sea voyager as well. Ports like Charleston, Kingston, or Port Royal were rough melting pots, rum dens, gambling tables, fights that broke out over pennies, and young sailors absorbed that life quickly, drinking, brawling, learning to defend themselves, swearing like veterans. Boys living this sort of life would have also been of interest to another type of recruiter, the British Army. And the next stage of Owen Parfitt's life saw him enlisting in the Army, and he later told his neighbors in Shepton Mallet that he had served most of his time as a soldier in Africa. Now, allegedly, the date on Owen Parfitt's discharge papers, his discharge from the Army, it didn't match the time when he physically left Africa. So some people in Shepton Mallet theorized that Owen had been involved in the slave trade or some other nefarious trafficking situation. So when 18th century Britons said someone had served in Africa, they usually meant West Africa, the Gold Coast, Sierra Leone, or the Bights of Benin and Biafra. These regions were also the main hubs of Britain's transatlantic slave trade at the time. And while the slave trade was primarily a commercial enterprise run by private merchants and companies, like the Royal African Company, military and naval personnel frequently intersected with it. Army units sometimes protected coastal forts and warehouses where enslaved people were held before being transported. Naval crews provided convoy protection for slave ships, and discharged soldiers occasionally found private employment with slavers or local middlemen. So if Owen's discharge papers did not match his claimed return date, when he returned to Shepton Mallet in England, it would cause his peers to suspect that after leaving the Army, he maybe lingered in Africa, perhaps working for slaving interests or participating in illicit trade. We do know that Owen returned to Shepton Mallet when he was middle-aged, and at that time he began working as a tailor. And apparently he was actually really good at it, even though I don't know if he was raised in that trade, if his father was in that trade, if he sort of learned this on his journeys, or if he just came back as a middle-aged man and was like, I'm going to be a tailor today, and then was actually really good at it naturally. I'm not sure. But, he made an okay living doing that. But at the time, it seemed that the people of the town saw Owen as a man who had lived dangerously, who had seen wild places, and had joined the ranks of violent men. It was said that Owen was in the habit of making mysterious journeys to Bristol, and when he returned, he was always flush with money that he couldn't have made as a tailor. Now, time went on and whispers about Owen's past and present activities persisted, but when he was a little older, Owen suffered from a stroke that caused challenges to his mobility. As the years went on, his condition worsened until he could barely walk, and he was unable to get in and out of bed on his own. Owen's sister Mary, who was actually significantly older than him, she eventually had to move into his cottage to help care for him. And when I say Mary was older than Owen, it is worth noting that both Owen and his sister lived far longer than most people did in those days, and it seemed that their entire family had a tendency to surpass the average life expectancy at the time, which was between 35 and 40, believe it or not. So technically, Owen Parfitt would have come back to Shepton Mallet, I don't know, in his late 20s, early 30s, maybe being like, hey, I've got 5 years left, 5 to 10 years if I'm lucky. I'm going to be a tailor now. I'm going to, start a whole new career and life, which is interesting. But yeah, the average life expectancy at that time was between 35 and 40. But the Parfitts were apparently a very hardy family, unnaturally hardy, some said, while others in Shepton Mallet buried children before their own hair turned gray. The Parfitts seemed to live on and on. Owen's mother reached 97 years old. His sister, Mary, was well into her 80s, and his father had passed away at the age of 69, and Owen himself was pushing 70 by the time he went missing, an age few men saw in those days. Now, people noticed this. In a town where faith and fear still shared the same pew, long life could look less like a blessing and more like a bargain made with someone, if you know what I mean. Now, in caring for her brother Owen, Mary often had the help of a local woman, Susanna Snook, who was around 25 years old and who lived close by in another cottage just 100 yards away from the Parfitts' home. Because he was unable to walk and because Mary was too old and weak herself to get her brother up and moving around that often, Owen would spend much of the day in his room, tucked into bed. Susanna would come over, usually in the early evening, and help Mary get Owen out of bed so the bed sheets could be changed and the bed could be remade. And this is what Susanna was doing at the Parfitt cottage on that fateful summer's evening of June 6, 1768. Susanna would later say she had helped Mary carry Owen downstairs. They had placed him in his usual chair outside the front door, which is where he would sit while the woman made his bed up. They got Owen settled in the chair, they draped his old overcoat over his shoulders, and left him to enjoy the fresh air and evening sun as they returned to the upstairs bedroom. When the bed was mostly made, Susanna went downstairs to return to her cottage briefly, and she distinctly remembered walking by Owen and exchanging a few words with him on her way out, although no source specifies what was said between them. Susanna said that she was gone for 15 minutes, 30 tops. And who knows what she was doing at home during that time, but a young woman living in Somerset in the 18th century would have had an endless rotation of small domestic tasks to fill her days with. She could have gone to scatter some grains for the chickens, she could have collected their eggs for her breakfast the next morning, or she could have gone to rekindle the fire in her kitchen. She may have been hanging wet laundry on the drying line, but at some point, Susanna looked up, and she could easily see Owen's cottage from her own yard. And when she locked eyes on the chair placed outside, she saw it was empty. Once again, Susanna Snook said she was gone 15 minutes. It may have been 30, but it was certainly no more than that. Upon noticing the empty chair and having the knowledge that Mary, in her 80s, would have been unable to move Owen inside on her own, Susanna dropped whatever she was doing and rushed back over. At the Parfitt cottage, she found Mary in quite a state, panicked and weeping bitterly. Mary said that after Susanna had left, she finished making the bed, and then she made her way downstairs. So Susanna's gone 15 to 20 minutes or 30 minutes tops. Mary is upstairs making the bed, maybe 10 minutes tops. So as soon as Mary got downstairs, she called out her brother's name. Once, twice. There was no response. When Mary stepped outside to check on Owen, she found his chair empty and his overcoat slung over the back of it. So remember, they had put the overcoat on his shoulders. When they come out and they see the chair's empty, the overcoat's still there. It's slung over the back of the chair now. So in a tizzy, Mary told Susanna that Owen was gone. He was lost, and she had no idea where he had gone off to. Susanna could hardly believe it. She had tended to the old man for months. She had never seen him take more than a few uneasy steps on his own. How could he have gotten up and walked away on his own and gotten any kind of distance where nobody could see him? So Susanna rushed around the house and the property searching for Owen, but when she found no sign of him, she ran into town and alerted everyone else. Now, a story in the Shepton Mallet Journal from 1867 reads, quote, "The news ran like wildfire that the old man had mysteriously disappeared, and the neighbors promptly hurried out to assist in the search. Scarcely, however, had they begun, when the weather, which up to that time had been fine and bright, suddenly changed. The sky became black with thunderclouds, and in a few minutes a tremendous storm of thunder, lightning, and rain burst upon Shepton Mallet." End quote. Even though the weather had turned, the search for Owen continued on, with townspeople checking every road, field, ditch, and forest within a 3 to 4 mile range. When night fell, they continued the search using lanterns, and over the next few days, every well and pond in the area had been dragged and checked, and the whole area for miles was canvassed. The entire town of Shepton Mallet was baffled. Everyone knew that Owen was unable to walk on his own, and unless he had suddenly and miraculously recovered, there was no way he could have vanished within the space of a half an hour. Because of this impossibility, people began to theorize that Owen had been taken by force, but even that seemed hard to believe, considering the circumstances. Search parties had been organized immediately. They had looked everywhere, and it was haymaking season, which meant the fields around the town were full of people either mowing the grass or making hay. Surely someone would have spotted a couple of unsavory characters making away with an old invalid man. An investigation was ordered, and the magistrate examined the scene and took statements from several witnesses, but nothing was discovered that shed any light on the mystery of Owen Parfitt's sudden disappearance. When the magistrate's inquiry turned up nothing, no clues and no culprits, the town was left with a silence that logic couldn't fill. People began to whisper that perhaps Owen hadn't been taken by men at all, that something older, darker, and unseen had claimed him. When the evidence runs out, the imagination steps in, and isolated communities like Shepton Mallet were rife with folk beliefs, the everyday spiritual logic of rural people that was passed down orally through generations in the form of rituals, customs, and spells. Things like hanging an iron horseshoe over the door to ward off evil, or burying a witch bottle filled with nails and hair near the hearth to protect against curses. Folk belief wasn't just about charms and omens, it was about order. In a world that often felt cruel and chaotic, superstition gave people a kind of moral map. If your crops failed, if your cow sickened, if lightning struck your home, there had to be a reason. Someone must have broken a rule, offended God, or drawn the devil's eye. So when something inexplicable happened in a place like Shepton Mallet, people didn't ask how, they asked why, and more importantly, they asked who deserved it. Now, I suppose it might have been comforting in a way. Misfortune wasn't random. It was the outcome of sin or folly, the proof that the universe still had laws even when the law of men failed. And these people were Christians, but in a way apart from traditional Christianity. They would go to church on Sunday and still tie a charm around their wrist, just in case. In a way, this blend of folk beliefs and religious vigor made sense. Early Christianity grew up in a world full of pagan ritual, charms, and household gods until church leaders drew a hard line, declaring that all supernatural power outside of God was demonic. Yet converts to Christianity didn't easily give up their old practices. They simply rebranded them. A Roman charm invoking a household spirit became a prayer to a Christian saint. A pagan ritual for fertility became a Christian blessing of the fields. Although the height of witch trials in England was earlier, during the 16th and 17th centuries, belief in witches, familiar spirits, evil charms, and local superstitions remained strong well into the 18th century. Even though the Witchcraft Act of 1736 repealed the old witch laws that had once led to executions, it didn't say witchcraft wasn't real, it just reclassified it as fraud. That is, it punished those who claimed magical powers, not those accused of using them. To the average, ordinary person, this didn't mean that witches had stopped existing. It only meant that the government and the church had stopped helping them fight the evil. In fact, the repeal was deeply unpopular in many rural areas. People felt abandoned, left to defend themselves against unseen forces without the protection of law or clergy. The West Country, places like Somerset, Devon, Dorset, and Cornwall, was one of England's last great bastions of witch belief. Even well into the 19th century, villagers there consulted white witches or healers to remove curses or find lost objects. They blamed witches for sickness, bad luck, spoiled butter, or dying livestock, and they avoided certain paths, crossroads, or houses that were said to be hag-ridden. The cultural fear and folklore persisted with tales of local witches, strange disappearances, and nighttime phenomena. Legends from areas around the Mendip Hills told stories of witches who rode the wind on broomsticks and black horses. Shepton Mallet itself had its very own illustrious and dark legend about Nancy Camel, a woman who was said to live in a cave deep in Ham Woods above the town. It is said that during a storm in November of 1703, a terrifying shriek was heard, and after the storm quelled, Nancy and her donkey had disappeared. Locals say 2 deep ruts or wheel marks were found in the stone outside her cave, as though the devil's cart had come to carry her off. By 1768, when Owen Parfitt disappeared, the people of Shepton Mallet still inhabited that mental world. And his story, an old man with a dark past, paralyzed yet unpredictable, vanishing without a trace, It had all the hallmarks of a moral parable in a community that still half believed in witchcraft. Not long after Owen's disappearance, one or two of his neighbors came forward and claimed to remember hearing him tell stories of magicians, necromancers, and Obi medicine men who he had come into contact with in Africa. Now, Obi is a term that came from West Africa, and it referred to a system of spiritual and medicinal knowledge. An Obi man was a healer and a spiritual intermediary, someone who understood how to use herbs, charms, and the spirit world to heal illnesses, protect people from evil, curse enemies, and influence luck or justice. It wasn't witchcraft in the European sense. It was a complex form of spiritual medicine similar to shamanism, but once it was transplanted through the Atlantic slave trade to the Caribbean, Obi became entangled with colonial fear and demonized as sorcery or black magic. British soldiers, sailors, and traders during the 1700s were both fascinated and frightened by these African spiritual practices as they witnessed the use of protective charms, which were usually small leather or gourd pouches containing herbs, teeth, and bones. They saw ritual dances and drumming, and they also noticed the intense respect locals had for the Obi men. Many Europeans misunderstood what they saw. They interpreted it through their own Christian and moral frameworks. To them, it looked like witchcraft, devil worship, or pagan activities. And so by the time Owen Parfitt disappeared, the word Obi had already entered English colonial vocabulary, mainly because of something called the Tacky Slave Rebellion. The rebellion had started in April of 1760 on the northeast coast of Jamaica, and it was led by an enslaved man named Tacky, who reportedly had once been an African noble or even possibly a military leader from the area that is now known as Ghana. Tacky and his followers attacked plantations, killed white overseers, and seized weapons from a fort, declaring their intention to drive the British out and establish an African-ruled Jamaica. British eyewitnesses reported that Obi men were central to that rebellion because many of the rebels went into battle wearing charm bags that were said to make them invincible to bullets. One British officer wrote that the rebels were bewitched into madness and that the Obi men had bound them with the devil's charms. Another said that captured slaves had confessed their loyalty to the Obi men who had promised them deliverance from the whites. In the wake of the rebellion, the colonial government passed the Obi Act of 1760, one of the first laws in the British Empire to specifically criminalize a non-European religion. It outlawed the, quote, wicked art of Obi and made practicing or possessing any related charms punishable by death or transportation, which at that time, transportation kind of meant like, we're going to put you on a ship and bring you somewhere. And who knows where these people were going to be brought, maybe to the New World to act as slave labor there, maybe out to sea and killed. I don't know, but they would get on ships, nobody would hear from them again. So the law framed Obi not as religion, but as sorcery and sedition, a weapon of revolt. And its language described Obi men as imposters who pretend to have communication with the devil. Now, this was the beginning of centuries of legal persecution of African-derived faiths across the Caribbean. Just as a historical note, that we could have a whole video on that itself. But that was really bad when across the Caribbean, because a lot of these areas in the Caribbean were British colonies, they really cracked down, and in a very bad way. So when the rugged adventurer, Owen Parfitt, returned to Somerset with tales of Obi men, it would have scared people. It would have come off as severely sinister, as if Owen had trafficked with dark powers abroad and brought them home with him. A newspaper report from 1892 says that it was possible in the past Owen had, quote, unholy traffic with these children of the devil, and some of them, at the bidding of their master, old Nickel Ben, had come and whisked him away to the realms of brimstone, unseen of mortal eyes, end quote. So the name Old Nick or Old Nickel Ben has been a folk nickname for the devil in England and Scotland since at least the 1600s. It appears in Scottish ballads, English sermons, and rural sayings as a euphemism for Satan. It's used when people didn't want to say the devil out loud. So basically, the people of Shepton Mallet could not understand what the heck had happened to Owen, but they knew he had lived a not-so-moral life, and they had heard he had knowledge of some dark stuff, and their conclusion was, of course, The devil did it. They also pointed to the sudden storm that came out of nowhere right at the time when Owen vanished, and they believed this was an indication that the prince of the power of the air had a hand in spiriting away the old man. Now, once again, the phrase, Prince of the Power of the Air, is one of the oldest biblical titles for Satan, and the storm connection comes from centuries of belief that the devil could control the wind, the weather, and the air itself. Before meteorology, weather wasn't just natural. People believed storms expressed divine or demonic will. In Scripture, both God and Satan are described as using wind or fire to destroy, and in folklore, sudden storms, gusts of wind, or unseasonable thunder often marked the presence of the devil, witches, or a soul being carried away. There were tales that ran through Somerset and Devon of gamblers and liars vanishing in lightning or whirlwinds, and when that happened, they were said to be carried off by Old Nick. Those on the Scottish borders told tales of the devil's wind snatching up witches or heretics at the hour of death, and in Yorkshire, there were legends of sudden gales blowing open doors at midnight, which meant the Prince of the Air was seeking souls. This belief went deeper than weather, though. The air itself was thought to be full of invisible forces, spirits, demons, and influences that could possess or corrupt. And in early modern English demonology, angels and spirits were considered aerial spirits. They moved through the air as their natural element. Witch trials often described spirits riding on the wind or witches flying in storms aided by the devil. Tempests, whirlwinds, or strong gusts during a death or disappearance were treated as literal evidence that the Prince of the Air was at work. Now, fun fact, this is why so many old English sayings are tied to the weather and to Satan. So when there was thunder, they would say, the devil's brewing. And when a sudden windstorm would pick up, they would say, Old Nick's abroad tonight. So for years, that was the story people told in Shepton Mallet, that Owen Parfitt, old, crippled, and wicked, had finally been carried off by the devil himself. Some said it was a fitting end for a man who'd trafficked with dark forces. Others whispered that it was punishment for his sins, a reckoning for the strange and secret life he'd lived. Whatever they believed, the legend of Owen's disappearance became part of the town's folklore, retold by candlelight on stormy nights, the kind of story meant to warn you what happens when you consort with the devil and his minions. But then, more than 40 years later, on a cold November morning, the legend cracked open. Sort of. On November 18, 1813, a man named Thomas Strode was digging in the front garden of his home, a house that had belonged to his family for half a century, a house located about 150 yards from where Owen Parfitt had last been seen. As his spade struck the earth, it hit something hard. At first, he thought it was a stone, but when he scraped the soil away, he saw the empty sockets of a human skull staring back up at him. Strode called for help, and before long, half the neighborhood had gathered, staring down into the shallow pit as he unearthed more bones. The skeleton itself lay just 2 feet below the surface, not in a coffin, not even straight, but crumpled, as if it had been thrown inside the ground in haste. Strode said the bones were twisted, the skull face down in the dirt. Whoever had buried the body hadn't cared to give it peace. Word spread quickly through Shepton Mallet. Some said the devil's victim, Owen Parfitt, had finally been found. Others said it proved the story had always been nonsense, that Owen hadn't been spirited away at all, but murdered and hidden close to home. Old memories stirred of that summer in 1768, of the storm that broke just as Owen vanished, of Mary Parfitt's tears and the empty chair by the cottage door. The local magistrate was notified, and an inquest was arranged. It drew townspeople like a magnet. They came out of morbid curiosity and old buried guilt, crowding the small room where the bones lay on a table under the magistrate's gaze. Witnesses from long ago were called back. Susanna Snook, gray-haired now, Jehoshaphat Stone, who still remembered the search, and others who had grown up on the story of Owen's disappearance. Susanna Snook repeated the story she had told that day in 1768. Her version of events had not changed or faltered in any way. Jehoshaphat Stone talked about how he had known the missing man, how Owen had made all of his clothes, and everyone always knew that he'd been carried off by supernatural means. But Stone also said something that no one had heard before. He said that Owen's sister Mary had claimed it was a noise downstairs, which had alerted her to something out of the ordinary and prompted her to check on her brother. He also claimed that Mary had said when she rushed outside, she'd found Owen's chair empty but displaced, as if it had been moved from the original position. So Susanna Snook was brought back up and she was questioned about these details, and she once again stuck to her story. She said she remembered very clearly that Mary had told her she hadn't heard a thing. Mary was upstairs making the bed. When she was finished making the bed, she came downstairs, called out her brother's name, and that's when she found out he was missing. And Susanna had seen for herself that Owen's chair had not moved from the spot. It had been where it was when she helped seat him in it. It also came out during the inquest that the cottage, which now belonged to Thomas Strode, had been inhabited at the time of Owen's disappearance by the widow Lockyer. Papers of the time talked about the widow Lockyer, saying she did not bear good character. They also said she was related to Owen Parfitt in some way and that she was on intimate terms with him. Now, I believe this means that not only was the widow Lockyer related to Owen in some way, hopefully distantly, but that she was also secretly and romantically involved with him, because they didn't say she was intimately involved with him, like, oh, they were old friends. Like, they said it suggestively. In the papers, they said it suggestively. So old details and new details began to mesh together to create a new theory about what had happened to old Owen Parfitt. Now, it had been no secret that Owen took many trips into Bristol before he became unable to walk, and after his stroke, it was said that he would sometimes receive strange visitors to his cottage in the middle of the night. It was also no secret that Owen was often in possession of large sums of money that he always carried on his person at all times in a belt bag, even keeping the bag with him after he was confined to bed. Now, could there have been people in Bristol who were interested in getting rid of Owen because he was either in possession of secrets that compromised them, or he could have been blackmailing these people, trading his silence for coins? It was also speculated that the widow Lockyer, who had been dead many years by the time of the inquest in 1813, she may have been involved in the plot to silence Owen Parfitt for good. She was described as being an aloof woman who kept to herself and wasn't even a little bit friendly. And if there'd been some relationship between the widow and Owen that turned bad, she may have been motivated by the thought of revenge and some extra money in her pocket that these men from Bristol may have promised. So if you want to explore the blackmail theory realistically, Bristol in the late 18th century is exactly the right place for it. It is one of Britain's most powerful but darkest cities at the time, a wealthy port built on secrecy, smuggling, vice, and the slave economy. The perfect breeding ground for the kind of people a man like Owen Parfitt could have crossed paths with, people who would kill to protect what they'd built. Between 1698 and 1807, over 2,100 slaving voyages left Bristol's port, carrying enslaved Africans to the Caribbean and the Americas. The captains and investors of these ships were often respectable merchants, bankers, landowners, city aldermen, or MPs, men who called themselves gentlemen and whose names were carved into the city's foundations, on banks, on schools, on monuments, but much of their wealth flowed from the dark waters of the Atlantic. William Miles, he was the mayor of Bristol, and he was an investor in West Indian commerce. Bristol alderman John Pinney owned a plantation in Nevis. These were the kinds of men who could smile in church pews while signing letters authorizing voyages that trafficked hundreds of people. And in polite society, no one spoke of it. The trade was veiled behind phrases like West India goods or merchant investments. Yet every dockside worker, every sailor, every clerk knew the truth, and men like Owen Parfitt, who had seen it up close, he knew just how valuable that secret could be. Now, it's not that the people of Great Britain at that time didn't know that the slave trade was happening. They knew about like plantations and stuff. They just didn't understand the severity of what was happening, right? There was no independent journalists at that time going to these places, taking pictures and printing exposés. None of that stuff was happening. Nobody was really talking about it. It was very separate. So the people of Britain would have known in some way that slavery was happening, but they really wouldn't have understood how these people were being, transported, how they were being treated, what They wouldn't have understood the gravity of it. And they wouldn't have really honestly wanted to think about it either, if we're being honest. And it wasn't until actually right around the time of Owen Parfitt's disappearance that abolitionists and people like that started coming out and really describing the concept of slavery, the state of slavery, what was happening to these people, how they were being treated, how they were being separated from their families, how they were, treated like livestock, like possessions and not human beings. And when that happened, there was a turn of the tide in Great Britain, and people were absolutely disgusted by what was happening. So these people, these men high up in the city, mayors and aldermen and, MPs and stuff, they would not have wanted the average person to know what they were up to, what they had interests in, what they were a part of, because it would have meant, a lot of scandal and probably a lot of ruin for them. And it's not an understatement to say that men like this would have a lot invested in their reputations, and they would do anything to keep their secrets buried. Everyone in Shepton Mallet knew that Owen Parfitt always seemed to have money, a bag heavy with coins that he kept on his person at all times. So if Owen had at any point helped these men, if he had acted as a messenger, if he was just aware of what was happening, and he was making his money from blackmailing or threatening men tied to Bristol's merchant elite, especially figures like William Miles, John Pinney, or their peers in the Society of Merchant Venturers, these men would have every reason to ensure that his voice was permanently silenced. These men were not petty criminals. They were the backbone of the city's power structure. They held civic office. They controlled shipping companies, banks, insurance firms, and West Indian plantations. Their reputations were everything, and it was a full-time job to ensure they remained sterling. If it became public that they were engaged in illicit or illegal trade, the fallout certainly would have been catastrophic, and they risked financial ruin, political disgrace, and in some cases, criminal prosecution for treason or illegal commerce. Even a rumor could destroy them, and blackmail, especially at the hands of a man already seen as morally suspect, a man like Owen, who was already known to be mixed up in these sorts of things, that was especially dangerous because people would believe him. And Owen, living on the outskirts of Shepton Mallet, was an old, cranky man that few people would miss outside of his sister and a handful of neighbors. Removing him would have been simple and suspicious to no one but locals who preferred a supernatural explanation anyway. And the storm that broke over Shepton Mallet that day, for Owen's killers, it would have been a gift, nature itself erasing their tracks. Now, you might say this explains everything. Owen was blackmailing these people. They got tired of it. They eventually came and they were like, let's get rid of this guy. He's a problem and no one's going to miss him. And they took him and they killed him and they buried him in the next door neighbor's property. Maybe they hid him in the widow Lockyer's house until night fell. And then with her assistance, she's holding a lantern. They're out there digging. They bury him. That's what happened. That solves it. No, because not long after, they found this skeleton that they assumed was Owen Parfitt. The coroner was like, sorry, guys, this is a woman. This is a young woman, probably in her 20s, maybe 30s. So first of all, now we have another mystery. Who was this woman buried in the ground? Is her death connected to Owen Parfitt's disappearance? Maybe she saw something that night. Who knows? Nobody knows who she is or what happened to her. Nobody in Shepton Mallet, who was still alive when that skeleton was found, could remember a young woman going missing. Another huge mystery, but it wasn't Owen Parfitt. So where did he go? Now, I like to think that Owen, being the kind of, pirate sort of rebel that he was, maybe he pretended to have a stroke. Maybe he pretended that he couldn't walk, and he was just like actually blackmailing people and building up all this money until one day he was like, all right, I'm 69 years old, but I can still walk around. I'm still alive. And I don't want to spend my last years here in Shepton Mallet where everybody hates me and thinks I'm like the devil's brother. So I'm going to take all the money that I've been sort of piling up and I'm going to, go back maybe to the Caribbean, maybe back to Africa, maybe go on another adventure, maybe, get on a ship and see where it takes me. And maybe he did walk himself into Bristol and, board a ship. Maybe he hid out in the widow Lockyer's house until night fell while everybody was searching for him. And maybe they had one last romantic tryst before he left Shepton Mallet for good. I don't know, but I like to think that's what happened. In the centuries since Owen Parfitt vanished from his chair on that June afternoon, dozens of theories have been put forward, some rational, some far stranger. The most straightforward explanation is that Owen was abducted and murdered by someone he knew. Even in his crippled state, he was a man who carried money on his person, who had lived a life full of danger and secrets, and who had attracted visitors at odd hours. So maybe somebody just killed him for the money they knew he had. Perhaps he was targeted for robbery or silenced because he'd been blackmailing someone. If that someone came from Bristol's powerful merchant world, a world steeped in smuggling, illicit trade, and the gun for slaves economy, then a quiet disappearance in a rural town would have been the easiest solution. Another theory suggests that those mysterious seafaring men who visit him were not friends, but business associates who had finally decided he was more liability than asset. Maybe because he couldn't walk anymore and he couldn't get out of bed. They were like, what good are you to us? You went in on this venture with us, but now you really can't do anything except collect your money, and we're sick of paying it to you. We're going to get rid of you, and then we'll keep your cut of the money for us. Maybe Owen knew something that could ruin them, or maybe they were just greedy. Maybe he possessed letters, memories, or names worth killing for. Or maybe they were just tired of him. I don't know. In this version, Owen was taken swiftly and efficiently. His body would be buried miles away, the storm masking any trace of the men who carried him off. Some have wondered if his own relatives or neighbors had a hand in it. The widow Lockyer, rumored to be both related to Owen and intimately involved with him, she lived just yards away from where a skeleton was later unearthed. We know that skeleton wasn't Owen, but was she hiding something? Was she a killer? Where did that woman come from? Was there jealousy, revenge, or opportunity happening behind closed doors? And like I said, yeah, that skeleton wasn't Owen, but why the hell does the widow Lockyer have a woman buried in her yard? That's another mystery, another unanswered question. Honestly, it could have been Owen's own sister, Mary, who got tired of him and his grumpy moods and just decided to put an end to it one morning. I mean, she was in her 80s, taking care of her brother, who probably was not appreciative, probably was grumpy, probably was verbally abusive to her, saying like, get me out of bed, Mary, I don't want to be here anymore. And she's like, I'm like in my 80s, man, I'm tired too. Maybe she just got sick of him not being appreciative and, yelling at her and being mean to her. And she was like, all right, well, that's it for you. We don't know what their relationship was like, but we do know that everyone said Owen Parfitt was a volatile, moody man who just wasn't everyone's favorite person to invite over for dinner. Like, he didn't have a lot of friends. And then, of course, there is the theory that Shepton Mallet embraced most eagerly, that Owen was taken by forces not of this world. The abrupt shift in the weather, the empty chair, the fact that he could not walk more than a step or two without assistance, all of it fit perfectly into the folklore of the Mendip Hills. For people raised on tales of Nancy Camel, witches in the storm, and the devil as the prince of the air, the idea that Owen was swept away by something supernatural was not merely plausible, it was comforting. If his disappearance could not be explained by human hands, then perhaps it belonged to the old stories, the warnings whispered at hearthsides long after dark. The truth is that we do not know, and likely never will. Owen left behind no footprints, no struggle, no trail. He simply ceased to be. Now, today, Shepton Mallet is a quiet place, but if you stand near Wester Shepton at dusk, where Owen's cottage once stood, the wind still moves strangely through the hedgerows. The Mendip Hills cast long shadows over the old turnpike road, and the air carries that heavy, ancient stillness you only feel in places where a story has settled into the earth. Maybe Owen Parfitt was taken by desperate men from Bristol. Maybe he was buried in some forgotten field, his secret dying with him, or maybe, just maybe, the people of 1768 were right, and the storm that rolled in over the hills wasn't just weather, but something reaching out from the unseen world. And the next time the sky blackens suddenly over Somerset, and the wind howls down the valley like something alive, remember there was once a man who sat in the sunshine here, and he vanished into thin air. Thank you so much for joining me for Harloween this year. This is our last Harloween video of 2025, but we'll be back next year, and I'll sprinkle some of these sorts of videos out throughout the year. It's good for me to take a break from true crime sometimes. It's good for you guys to take a break from true crime sometimes, and I just enjoy doing them, and it seems you guys enjoy hearing and watching them, so we'll have more. But we are now moving on to another true crime case next time that it actually could be part of Harloween, but isn't. And it's very interesting to me, and I found it in a very strange way. So we're going to talk about all of that next time. Thank you so much for being here. Give Rosie all your positive thoughts. Tell her you hope her surgery goes well and you hope she's feeling better because she's such a sweetie pie. Say bye, Rosie. Bye, I'm a sweetie pie. She is such a sweetie pie. Thank you so much for being here. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. Like the video if you liked it. Share it if you think it's worth sharing. And until next time, stay kind, stay beautiful, stay safe, and stay spooky. And I'll see you very soon.